Welcome to this session. My name is Barbara Gochalia. Today we are going to look at the International Monetary System. The International Monetary System. And this is our chapter overview. We shall be looking at macroeconomic policy goals in an open economy. We shall also be looking at the international macroeconomic policy under the gold standard, which lasted from 1870 to 1914. We shall be looking at the interwar years, the interwar period that lasted from 1918 to 1939. And then we shall be looking at the Bretton Woods system and the International Monetary Fund. We shall look at internal and external balance under the Bretton Woods system. And we shall also look at analyzing policy options under the Bretton Woods system. So first and foremost, we have to know what an open economy means, right? So when we talk about an open economy, we mean an economy that that engages in international trade, right? That engages in international trade, for example, exporting and importing, right, of goods and services. And with open economies, they make it is difficult for governments to achieve full employment and the price stability, right? So we shall be looking at the external and the internal balances. So in open economies, policymakers are motivated by two goals, what we call the internal balance and the external balance. So the internal balance basically involves these policymakers ensuring that there is price stability and that there is full employment of a country's resources. Then for external balance, it involves a country working towards attaining a balance of payment equilibrium, a balance of payment equilibrium. So when we talk about a balance of payment equilibrium, it means that in this perspective, an economy is not experiencing a balance of payment surplus nor a balance of payment deficit. So what is the meaning of balance of payment? We shall be looking at that. So let's first of all get to know the meaning of full employment. What is the meaning of full employment? Full employment means that the available labor resources in an economy are being used in the most efficient way. In other words, full employment may not necessarily mean that there is no unemployment, but it means that there is no cyclical unemployment, and it means that it actually means low employment levels, but in low unemployment levels, but zero non-zero employment levels or low unemployment levels. Are we together? So full employment practically it is when all the labor resources within an economy are used in the most efficient way. In other words, the people that are looking for jobs in an economy are able to find these jobs, right? But then we realize that if we have underemployment, if we are not operating, if an economy is not operating under full employment, then it means either it is operating under what you call underemployment or overemployment. Underemployment means that people are having jobs that are jobs where their qualifications are higher than those jobs, underemployment. And then overemployment means that workers are taking extra time. They're working more hours than the required standard hours for work, right? So in such scenarios of underemployment and overemployment, an economy experiences what we call price level instability, right? And whenever there is a price level instability, that is not a good position for any economy, right? It leads to scenarios of macroeconomic imbalances. So in that scenario, when we have underemployment and the overemployment, which brings about price level instability, then the government has to ensure that it works towards having an equilibrium, having a aggregate demand being equal to the aggregate supply. Now, when we talk about aggregate demand, we mean the total demand for all goods and services in an economy, right? And then the aggregate supply, aggregate means total. The total of goods and services that can be availed on the market in an economy. So for us to have BOP, for us to be to avoid price instabilities, economies have to make sure that the aggregate demand is equal to the aggregate. They should work towards having aggregate demand being equal to the aggregate supply, and also they should work towards having regulating money supply, such that there is no low supply of money or there is no excess supply of money. Even the money market has to be in equilibrium, whereby we should have, economies should work towards having money supply being equal to money demand. So what are the problems with the excessive current account deficit? Well, first of all, we need to know the meaning of current account. We need to know the meaning of current account. Current account. So important for us to know is that when we talk about balance of payment, right? The balance of payment account, we basically have balance of payment account for any economy, right? That balance of payment account involves the two accounts. It involves the two accounts. It involves what we call the current account and the financial account. It involves what we call the current account and the financial account. It involves what we call the current account and the financial account. So the current account involves exports and imports. The current account involves the exports and imports. Exports and imports, right? Exports and imports, right? So when you talk about current account deficit, for example, right, or current account surplus, when you talk about current account deficit, it means that imports are greater than exports. When you talk about current account surplus, it means that exports are greater than imports. Are we together? And then when we talk about financial account, here we are talking about the reserve account and the non-reserve account, right? So here, this one is subdivided into what we call the reserve account and the non-reserve account. The reserve account, I'm afraid my annotation pen is not writing, but under financial account, we have the reserve account and the non-reserve account. The reserve account includes a country's foreign exchange currency, which is held by a country's central bank, right? And the reserve account also includes a country's assets, which include, for example, gold, minerals, and so on. Are we together? And then still under, that was the reserve account, under the financial account. And then we have the non-reserve account. So for the non-reserve account, it will consider the change in assets that are owned by domestic citizens, in foreign assets that are owned by domestic citizens, and also domestic assets that are owned by foreigners in a country. I hope that is clear. So practically it involves the non-reserve account under the financial account, practically involves inflows and outflows. Are we together? These outflows, for example, can be that if it is a country's citizens, a country's domestic citizens, they are owning assets in another country or outside the country's border, right? Or the foreigners are owning domestic assets within a country. So the difference between those inflows and outflows is what gives us the non-reserve account. So I hope it is clear and up to that level. If there is anything unclear, please feel free to ask, right? So when we talk about the balance of payment account, we practically talk about those two accounts, the current account and the financial account. And at the end of the day, we should have an equilibrium. We should not have BOP deficit or BOP surplus, right? Economies work towards having macroeconomic stability by having BOP equilibrium. I hope we are together up to that level. All right. So when we talk about current account surplus, we are practically talking about exports being greater than the imports. That's under the current account, right? All right. So in scenarios of countries or economies experiencing excessive current account surplus, this may mean that it implies lower investment in domestic plant and equipment, right? It may imply low investments in domestic plants and equipment. It may also create potential problems for creditors to collect their money, right? Of course, with the current account surplus here, we mean that excessive. If it is excessive, it should not be in excess, and again, it should not be in low surplus. So anything in excess of that, whether deficit or surplus, anything against the that is beyond the equilibrium, either below or above the equilibrium, will bring about problems in the macroeconomic stability. Are we together? So current account surpluses are also not good if they are excessive, right? It should be, of course, average or relative, right? So let's look at the international macroeconomic policy under the gold standard. So the gold standard was a period that lasted from 1870 to 1914, and under that period, the gold standard meant that gold was the major form of currency, right? Gold was the major form of currency. In other words, gold was used as a medium of exchange. Gold coins, yeah, they were used as a medium of exchange, as a unit of account, and as a store of value. So gold was the major form of currency. So let's look at external balance under the gold standard. We've already had a brief a brief overview about the external balance. And we've seen that external balance, under external balance, economies aim at having a BOP equilibrium, having a balance of payment equilibrium. And this balance of payment equilibrium is practically the central bank help in executing this, right? How do they help in executing this? They will ensure that they will actually have that primary responsibility to preserve the official parity between their currency and gold. So under the gold standard, actually, we are going to realize that gold was the major form of currency. So here, with external balance, economies will be using gold to back up their currency. If you've heard about a currency being backed by gold, then we are going to know what it means for a currency to be backed by gold. So under the gold standard, practically gold backed up these currencies, and they adopted policies So they adopted policies, these central banks, of course, around the world, they adopted policies that pushed the non-reserve component of the financial account surplus. We've already seen what the financial account surplus, of course, if it is a surplus, it means that the inflows, the inflows are greater than the outflows, right? Right? The country's inflows are greater than the outflows, right? So these central banks, of course, they aimed at working towards attaining a balance of payment equilibrium. So under this period, the gold standard, the governments took what you call, they adopted what we call a laissez-faire attitude towards the current account. Laissez-faire is a French word that means let it alone. In other words, it means a free market economy, or what you simply call perfect competition, right? And with the perfect competition or laissez-faire here, the prices are determined by the forces of demand and supply. In other words, with the laissez-faire here, it means that there is no government intervention in terms of determination of prices, right? So here, practically what happened is that governments were using what we call that laissez-faire. They adopted that laissez-faire attitude towards the current account. And when we talk about the current account, of course, now we are talking about the exports and the imports, right? So in this perspective, we are going to see how these countries around the world actually were able to use these macroeconomic policies of ensuring external balance, that is the balance of payment equilibrium. So there was what you call the rule of the game under the gold standard, the rule of the game. And the rule of the game basically was that they used right, and the rule of the game is that they used in terms of BOP surplus, there is a rule they followed, and in terms of when an economy was experiencing a BOP deficit, they also used a particular rule. So for example, in periods where a country was experiencing a balance of payment deficit, then what happened is that they would sell some of their domestic assets, right? They would sell some of their domestic assets. Of course, balance of payment deficit means that the imports are greater than the exports, which is not a good position, right? So in that scenario, because they wanted to get more foreign currency, right? Of course, the more foreign currency you have, if, for example, you have the more dollars in the country, in terms of, in periods when you've been experiencing a BOP deficit and you acquire more dollars or more foreign currency, it means that it is going to improve, yeah? It is going to increase the exchange rate or improve it, and thereby revaluing the country's currency. Are we together? So in times, in moments or in periods when economies were facing, under this rule of the game, under the gold standard, when economies were facing a BOP deficit, they would sell their domestic assets. For example, they would sell gold, and of course to other countries, and in return they would get foreign exchange. And of course, when they got foreign exchange, this would increase the amount of foreign currency on what we call the reserve account, yeah. Of course, with the central banks, and we've seen that the reserve account is where the central bank, it means foreign currencies that of an economy that are kept by the central bank, and it also involves the assets, domestic assets like gold, minerals, and so on, right? So that was the logic of the game, and for an opposite where these economies were experiencing balance of payment surplus, the opposite would happen. For balance of payment surplus, they would buy foreign assets. They would buy foreign assets. And of course, buying foreign assets, when you buy any good, what happens? In return, you are paying the other people money. And of course, you are paying them, there is foreign exchange, you're paying them money, isn't it? So because you've been experiencing a BOP, balance of payment surplus, you have excess of the foreign currency in your economy. So you need to reduce that excess by buying foreign assets. That was the logic with the rules of the game under the gold standard. So let's, of course, now that one was done, that rule of the game was done to practically bring about, ensure BOP equilibrium, balance of payment equilibrium, such that there is no BOP surplus or BOP deficit. Now let's look at the interwar years. Now, important for us to note is that when we talk about the interwar years, we must know that the World War I began in 1914. It lasted the period from 1914 to 1918. And the World War II started from 1939 to 1945, right? So in the period between 1870, which we call the what? The gold standard, 1870 to 1914, that was the gold standard, where we've seen that gold was the major form of currency. And then from 1918, right? 1914 to 1918 was World War I. But then in 1918, the period between 1918 to 1939 was the interwar period, right? And of course, now when the World War came in, the gold standard was suspended. Gold standard, the whole element of using gold as the major means of exchange, medium of exchange, was suspended, of course, after the eruption of the World War I, that was from the period 1914 to 1918. So 1918 to 1939 was the interwar period, right? So in that period, of course, the World War I was a war that originated from Europe. It started in Europe, and then it spread to the rest of the world. So in the war, of course, ravaged the economies around the world economically, and they experienced severe economic instability, given the fact that there were reparation payments, yeah, Reparation payments is whereby they're also called war indemnities, yeah, whereby if a country during that the war, during that interwar period, if a country defeated, right, another country, then that country which was defeated would pay. In return, would pay that country which has defeated it for the costs that it has incurred during the war. Those are the reparation payment. And the reparation payment led to hyperinflation in Europe, whereby we had countries like Germany experiencing high levels of inflation, experiencing hyperinflation. So in the interwar, in the interwar period, in 1919, we had, of course, in the interwar period, the gold standard was suspended. And in 1919, we saw the United States of America return back to gold. So the United States of America in 1919 went back to adopting the gold standard. And then in 1922, we had a group of countries and these were Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, that actually agreed. They called a program to agree to return to the gold standard, of course, with objectives of using their central banks to attain external and internal objectives. Of course, now when we talk about external and internal objective, I'm very certain that those who started know what we mean. We've seen that internal objectives, of course, happen within the economy, and these are basically to ensure price stability and full employment. And external balances is basically where economies are ensuring balance of payment equilibrium. In 1925, Britain returned to the gold standard, but in 1929, the world experienced what we call the Great Depression. The world experienced what we call the Great Depression. Of course, the Great Depression was a period, that was the interwar period, right? That was the interwar period, right? Where the world was experiencing the Great Depression. Of course, this was when economies were around the world were ravaged economically because of the World War I, right? Because of the World War I. So that period of the Great Depression, we saw the world saw its banks around the world failing, bank failures, banks becoming bankrupt throughout the world. Greater banks in the world, like that one in the United States called the Lehman Brothers, which had been formed in the 1800s, it collapsed. So, right? So the Great Depression, the Lehman Brothers was in the global financial economic crisis, but this is the Great Depression. So in the Great Depression, we also experienced bank failures, right, throughout the world. Then in 1931, Britain was forced off the gold standard because the foreigners that were holding their pounds in Britain lost confidence, given the fact that Britain had failed to maintain the current the currency, the value of its country currency. All right. So what happened in the interwar period, right? In the interwar period, what happened was that because countries were ravaged economically, and during the Great Depression, countries began now to put restrictions on international trade and payment. These restrictions, they began to put, for example, to impose quotas, tariffs, yeah, of course, to discourage imports, and they wanted to discourage the whole essence of imposing quotas and tariffs or putting restrictions on on international trade was practically to encourage exports and discourage imports. So as a result, given the fact that each country was doing so, putting restriction on international trade, even other countries retaliated, even other countries revenged, right? So the revenging is what we call the beggar my neighbor policies. So other countries also adopted the beggar my neighbor policies, which were practically retaliating or revenging to those countries that were imposing restrictions like tariffs and quotas on their economies in terms of national that were imposing restrictions on international trade. So these other countries were also retaliating or revenging, and the revenge is what we call the beggar my neighbor policy. And so because of these countries' economic situation became worse, right? So as a result, what happened was that now in 1944 July, we saw what we call the Bretton Woods system, And under the Bretton Woods system, Bretton Woods is a place in New Hampshire in the US. So it was called Bretton Woods system because this was a meeting that was done in a place called Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in the United States. New Hampshire is a state in the United States. So under this Bretton Woods system, it saw the formation of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Earlier on, we looked at international financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, right? So the IMF was formed in 1944 after this Bretton Woods system, where 44 representing countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to set up a system of fixed exchange rates, And this is where the whole element of having exchange rates arose or originated. So under this Bretton Woods system, where the International Monetary Fund was formed, the International Monetary Fund had an objective. This Bretton Woods system had an objective, under the IMF had an objective of fixing currencies, fixing all countries' currencies against the United States dollars, right? So this whole business of fixing currencies against maybe the US dollar and so on began during this period of the Bretton Woods system, where all currencies were fixed against the United States dollars, and an unvarying dollar price of gold of $35 for an ounce was set. So $1 had 1 ounce, right? 1 ounce of gold. 1 ounce of gold is 0.0283 kilograms. Yeah. So 1 ounce of gold went for 35 United States dollars. But again, all currencies were now fixed against the United States dollars. So the Bretton Woods system had an objective of fixing countries' currencies against the United States dollars, number one. And the second objective was intended, of course, through the International Monetary Fund that had been formed. It was intended to provide lending to countries that were facing current account deficits, to lend to countries that were facing current account deficit. And when we are looking at the IMF, we saw that one of its objectives is to actually to reduce poverty through lending these loans to these developing countries. But of course, during the interwar period, it was to give out loans, to lend to these countries that were experiencing the current account deficit. And when we talk about current account deficit, we practically mean the exports and of course, the current account deficit means that the imports are greater than the exports. So countries that were facing such scenarios of a current account deficit were to get lending from the IMF. And then under this Bretton Woods system, it aimed at currency convertibility, that we have already seen that all countries' currencies around the world were pegged around the United States dollar. So let's look at the goals and the structure of the IMF, the goals and the structure of the IMF, right? We looked at those ones in our previous class, right? So the IMF also aimed at maintaining external balance, right? It aimed at helping countries to allow them to attain external balance, and external balance, of course, without sacrificing their internal objectives or fixed exchange. When we talk about external balance at this level now, I know that we know it very well. External balance is maintaining the balance of payment equilibrium, right? So the IMF had an objective of helping these countries that were facing BOP deficits to attain BOP equilibrium, or to attain external balance, but again, not at the expense of their internal objectives. And we've seen internal objectives. These are practically price stability and full employment, right? So I hope we are together. We are together. Of course, this would be through IMF lending facilities and also adjustable parities, where we've seen that adjustable parities here, they were it involved, for example, we've seen the rule of the game, right, under the gold standard, where under BOP deficit, these countries would sell their domestic, some of their domestic assets to gain more foreign currency to deal with the BOP deficit. And under a BOP surplus, they would buy foreign assets to reduce the excess reserves, the excess foreign exchange, to also deal to curb the balance of payment surplus. Now, let us look at, we've already looked at the internal external balance, the meaning of that. We've already looked at the Bretton Woods system. Now let's look at the speculative capital flows and crises, the speculative capital flows and crises. So what happened here is that countries that were experiencing current account deficit under this period, right? Under this gold standard, we are looked at as countries that were facing fundamental disequilibrium. They were looked at as countries that were facing fundamental disequilibrium under the IMF Articles of Agreement. And again, countries that were facing large current account surpluses were looked at or were viewed as candidates of re-evaluation. So this gave a different impression to these these two scenarios for the countries that were experiencing either BOP deficit or BOP surplus. So that led to crisis, of course. Now, let's look at, let's analyze the policy options under the Bretton Woods system. Let's look at the policy options under the Bretton Woods system. And of course, here, the policy options, we are going to see what was done to ensure that there was internal balance as well as external balance, right? Of course, here with the Bretton Woods system, they aimed at helping countries, assisting countries to attain, through the IMF, assisting countries to attain external balances, of course, not at the cost of their internal objectives, right? So there were basically two policies that were used, right, to help these countries obtain BOP equilibrium. And these were expenditure changing policies, So with expenditure changing policies, these are policies that are undertaken, let's begin with expenditure switching policies, right? So under the Bretton Woods system, these were policies that were undertaken to help countries obtain external balance, which is literally balance of payment equilibrium. So the first policy was the expenditure switching policy. Expenditure switching policy means that it is a policy that aims at change I should say exchanging the consumption, the country's citizens' consumption from consuming imported goods to consuming domestic goods. So expenditure switching policies are aimed at ensuring that a country's citizens are consuming domestic goods rather than imported goods. And how is this done? It is done by imposing restrictions, by putting restrictions on international trade, or by increasing barriers to international trade. And what are these barriers? Tariffs, right? A tariff is a tax on imports. Tariffs, quotas, and or protectionist subsidies. We looked at those ones when we were looking at the political economy of international trade. You'll have to go back and remind yourself. But practically with expenditure switching policies, these are policies that aim at ensuring that a country's citizens are consuming domestic products rather than imported goods. And this is done through increasing barriers or restrictions to international trade. These barriers can be in terms of tariffs, in terms of quotas, and other protection or protectionist subsidies, right? And also that was expenditure switching policy. And then the second type of policy option that was used during the Bretton Woods system was the expenditure changing policy. Now, the expenditure changing policy, they aim at affecting income and employment. They aim at affecting income and employment with the goal of equating domestic expenditure along with domestic production. So these expenditure changing policies, it can be in form of fiscal or monetary policy. They can be in form of fiscal or monetary policy, right? So I'm going to briefly talk about the monetary policy. I know for those of us that have done some macroeconomics, we might have come across such concepts, but let me explain the monetary policy and the fiscal policy such that we get the logic behind these policies being able to bring about balance of payment equilibrium or external balance. So the monetary policy is basically monetary policy is executed by the central bank, by any country's central bank, and it aims at regulating money supply. It aims at regulating money supply, whereby in the periods where an economy is experiencing excessive money supply, of course, with excessive money supply, we shall have scenarios of aggregate demand exceeding aggregate supply, right? It increases aggregate demand for goods and services, and if nothing is done to increase supply of goods and services, we shall have a scenario where there is a lot of money chasing a few goods, and in that perspective, an economy will be experiencing a shortage in the supply of goods and services, and so the prices will increase, leading the persistent increase in the general price levels will lead to inflation. So if we have excessive money supply, we know that this one, if not regulated, it will lead to scenarios of inflation, right? And of course, we know that inflation reduces the value. It reduces the value of a country's currency, or it devaluates a country's currency. So these are macroeconomic imbalances, right? Now, what happens here with monetary policy? It will be able, through the central bank, to regulate the money supply. It should not be excess money supply, and again, the money supply should not be low. So the monetary policy, practically, it aims at having an equilibrium in the money market, where we have money supply being equal to money demand, right? So of course, it will use those monetary policy instrument tools like the OMO, open market operation. It will use the bank rate. It will use the legal reserve requirement. It will use the selective credit control. It will use the moral situation, right? So it will use the OMO. I'll be sharing the details of these policy tools in the actual notes, right? In the actual notes, these are just slides. So I'll be providing the details of these monetary policy tools and how the central banks of countries use it to regulate money supply. And of course, regulating money supply will bring about price stability. It will bring about price stability. Then the fiscal policy. The fiscal policy here, practically, it is a policy that is used by the government. It is, whereas the monetary policy is used by the central, executed by the central bank, right? But the fiscal policy is executed by the government. So the fiscal policy will involve, it basically has two tools. It has to do with the taxes and government spending. The fiscal policy has to do with controlling taxes and government spending. Of course, where we see that in scenarios where there is excessive money supply, for example, the excessive money supply, we shall use the contractionary. When there is excessive money supply, the contractionary fiscal policy will be used. And with the contractionary fiscal policy, it will involve reducing government spending and increasing taxes. With the contractionary fiscal policy, it will involve reducing government spending, and increasing taxes. The whole essence here will practically be to reduce the amount of money supply within the economy, and in periods of low money supply, or in periods of a recession, there it means we have low money supply. What happens is that the expansionary fiscal policy will be used, and the expansionary fiscal policy will be totally the opposite of the contractionary fiscal policy. The expansionary fiscal policy will involve increase in government expenditure. It will involve, because it is expansionary, it will involve increase in government expenditure and reduction in taxes. And the whole essence will be to increase money supply in the economy, because previously there would have been a recession or low money supply that would have been brought about by low economic activity in an economy. All right, so I want us to stop here for this session until next time.